Hi, I'm Vivian. I'm a curator at the Vitra Design Museum, and I'm very excited to be talking to someone very interesting today, to Julia Lohmann. We've been speaking with each other for more than a year because sometimes here we do kind of keep in touch with designers we find really interesting, and sometimes it takes a while to get projects to fruition. And Julia is one such person. She's currently living in Helsinki, where she's professor of contemporary design at Alva Aalto University. And she's perhaps best known for her project called the Department of Seaweed, which is actually not really a project because that would seem that there is an end to it, but it's a platform that she started about 7 years ago.
Oh, there she is.
Yes.
Hello. That was a little bit of a suspense. Um,
Sorry, it took a while. We have
yeah,
we have the account on two phones, and we weren't sure which one's ringing.
that's right. Well, hi. So nice to see you here. Um, Last time we saw each other, I came over to Finland to see your work. And so, yeah, I'd love to talk to you about some of your projects. I'm sure lots of people haven't sort of know them, but maybe not the intricacies of them. So I'd like to start by asking you what actually the Department of Seaweed is. I made an attempt before to explain it, but I think I couldn't possibly explain it as well as you.
Well, it was 12 years ago that I started working with seaweed, and one of the first insights I had was that it takes an awfully long time to kind of develop a new material or craft around a material that has an amazing potential, and that you can't possibly do this by yourself. And so it brought me to understand that instead of just being a maker who works with the material, I also need to be a facilitator of a community of practice who all share a similar values, why they want to work like this and so forth. And so that's in a way the beginning of the Department of Seaweed, and it was then kind of a collaborative effort with, for example, Violaine Bouy, who's a textile designer from France, and Miriam Pepich and Florian, and basically we all kind of wanted to build this community together.
Right. And what does that mean? It was just a number of people who were all designers who wanted to work with seaweed, or did they come from all kinds of walks of life, and there were artists as well?
Well, it's basically just the beginning so far. So one thing we realized quickly was that we cannot possibly have all the knowledge within the field of design to make the changes we need to make in the 21st century. So we need to collaborate with scientists on a macro level. We need to kind of understand the ecological impact of the materials we work, not just when we work with them, not just when we discard them, but even in their original ecosystem when they're being grown and so forth. And we also need to have a lot of knowledge on the micro scale, on the microscopic structures and so forth. So the Department of Seaweed is an attempt, and I say an attempt because it's just the beginning. It's basically a dream that we can share some of the knowledge we need to really make a change and have an impact by using seaweed in a way that puts the ecology first, in a sense that when you grow seaweed, you can have positive ecological impact if you do it in the right way to create that impact. And I believe if we all come together from all walks of life, so yes, there should be scientists in there, chemists, ecosystem science people, there should be philosophers in there. In a way, everyone should be part of it with their share of knowledge. And the idea is that the Department of Seaweed helps us create a lens through which we all imagine what futures we would like to have with seaweed, or through seaweed rather, because if we are now managing to develop a new craft around seaweed that is so very different to the other crafts, that is kind of puts the environment and our place in the environment first, then that can also shine a light on other production techniques, other ways of working with materials.
Okay,
So I don't know whether I answered your question, but the idea is that the Department of Seaweed is big, really transdisciplinary, and that I am one of many members of the Department of Seaweed.
Okay, I'd like to, I'm very curious about seaweed as a material, but let's talk about design first. So, am I understanding you correctly that what you're proposing is that design isn't, perhaps it's never been, but it definitely isn't anymore a singular practice where one person is sort of this genius who proposes an idea and gives form to it. It's more, it needs to be a collaborative effort because you need to combine so much knowledge from different areas. Is that the at the core of the Department of Seaweed?
Yeah, partly. I think yes, it is, but I think it still needs designers also to, in a way, be this visionary, be like, wow, look what you can make, look, look what you can create. So, for example, with the structures I'm making, I'm not solving the problems. I'm not addressing a large scale production problem or a large scale environmental impact. I'm raising the possibility of what if we can use this material in a very different way. But I don't just want to put this piece there and then leave it at that and then kind of give up the strength. But there is a whole big idea around why we need to have this discussion and we need to have this possibility. So I see design as an integrative practice, very much like philosophy, for example, that is integrated, that you can have a philosophy to every practice. And so you can have design methods within every practice. But with the difference being that design always has action within it. So we're not just talking about something. We are trying to change situations into preferred ones. And to do that, we have to first understand what the situation is. Then we have to understand what the preferred situation is. And then we have to figure out how to get there. And this understanding, it sounds easy, but it's quite complex, because if we now all start using seaweed and it's a big craze and we start kind of dredging all the original kind of seaweed forests that already have a problem with climate warming and so forth, then we are not helping it. So in a way, you already have to understand an ecological problem and an ecological system, at least to a certain extent, to know how to act within it and how to improve it. And that's the idea, that design could become this regenerative practice with which we are actively engaging with the imbalances that we've created as humans and rethinking this very human-centric position that design has nowadays, and readdressing it maybe from the perspective of the non-human stakeholders in that ecosystem, and trying to design for them and with them. And for that, we need kind of course, all the stakeholders and all the people who know about their needs, for example, on board.
Okay, so the Department of Seaweed really is an expression of a different kind of understanding of design that you're proposing. Is that right?
Yes, but I wouldn't say it's so different. I think this is, in a way, the direction, also the mainstream direction design is going in. So there is a great diagram by Richard Buchanan, a design theoretician, who basically was mapping that the practice of design across scales. So he was saying design used to be mainly in designing objects and designing communications. So signs and symbols and objects, very classified, very much like posters and toasters framing. But then we're still doing that as designers. We will keep doing that in the future. But design has expanded into this practice that then looks at the interconnections. So designing services, designing interactions, designing what holds these things and humans together. And then it's expanded further with like transition design and these notions and speculative design into asking where we're going. So much longer term trajectories into different kinds of future. But that's the diagram of Richard Buchanan. But I think it's also expanded as a discipline into the microcosm. So basically, we are not just designing with the materials we're given, we are also designing the materials themselves. We're also looking at molecule chains and looking at CRISPR, at DNA, and so forth. So we really kind of, there has been an expansion in both directions. And that expansion means that designers are networkers. They still have their core in this very tangible spectrum that is very close to the human, and therefore they can make very complex things with knowledge scattered across all these scales, graspable, understandable, communicable. And that's what I think designers have been trained to do forever, this kind of making things visible, making things understandable, making things usable.
But you're also in a great position because you're teaching design. So even if you're saying, I'm not sure how old this, I know this theory by Richard Buchanan, but I think it's not yesterday. It's not a few years ago. It's quite some time ago that he made this diagram, right? Do you know when?
Yeah, I think it was the early 2000s. Yeah, it's not. Yeah.
Yeah. So the design practice has been changing, and if anyone sees it, it would be someone like you, because you're teaching designers and you're also kind of stipulating what you're going to teach. And I think, from what I understand, I rang you the other day to ask you whether you want to do this talk, and you were just in the forest with students collecting mushrooms. So that's not necessarily something you think about when you think that about a class of designers or design students. So how does this understanding or this approach to design manifest in your teaching practice?
Yes, this mushroom course is running at the moment. I'm teaching at Aalto University in Helsinki, and I'm teaching this course with my wonderful colleague Anna van der Leij. And she already taught the fungi course last year, whereas I've been more into the seaweed courses. But there is this parallel with fungi and with seaweed. They are both materials that do not have such a long, varied history, but that have a huge potential to become a future material. So they are amazing materials to speculate with and to think with. And at the same time, what they offer is that they have such an intricate, complex part in their respective ecosystems and play such an important role that they let us highlight both kind of where we can go as designers, how we have to integrate knowledge from different disciplines to figure out what to do with these materials, how we can dream about what we should do, and then also how we can go back to the forest, and that's what we were doing that day, and understand what we're taking from it and whether there's any way of designing that helps the forest. You know, can we take something that, not just with this mindset of, oh, this is me, I can take it because it's undervalued material, can we do something there? So yes, it's the first course of the master. And also what's wonderful, of course, is that we are able through these forest visits to get the students to also meet each other face to face, because I think especially for the ones that come from another country, if you come to Finland and you have to spend the first 2 weeks in quarantine in your little student dorm, you really, really want to meet the other students in the cohort. And in the forest, that's all possible. So we're going out as much as possible.
But in a practical sense, are you, does it mean that, you know, especially those design students who are starting this master's now, what's your agenda to kind of make them really curious? And is that a kind of a key characteristic that you want these designers to go, or to these students to go away with out of their masters, to have that curiosity so they can perform design in the way that you are proposing we need to perform it, like being kind of the glue between a lot of different disciplines and the
yeah, I mean, curiosity is definitely one part of it. I think that what we're teaching in this course is the ability to ask critically, to ask the next question, to always kind of not just think with, ooh, there's this material and oh, great, I'm going to make a beautiful form out of it, but to ask, where does it come from? Where does it go? What does it mean? So find a deeper meaning in the things with which we're designing. And then also to, this critical reflection, I think, and then also to understand themselves, to kind of always engage their own values, their own questions of why we're designing and how we're designing, and to find their own voice within it. So we started with asking them to kind of map some stories of their own families with fungi. So I think that's kind of one of the things, to kind of look a bit further. And then, of course, so in a way, that's the other thing, to really write your own brief, to be introduced to a situation that is maybe not a classical design situation, that is not a classical, let's do a chair, let's do a toaster, let's do something where we are on safe ground, because we know kind of safe ground. Of course, doing a chair is maybe more terrifying than doing anything else as a designer. but that they actually kind of are introduced to a non-design situation where they then have to think, okay, how do I relate this to my practice? How do I find my voice here? is that relevant? What is relevant here for me? So it's a very good learning in that respect too, I think.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about seaweed for a moment. You've mentioned in this talk, but also in previous talks that I've seen and conversations that I've had with you, that seaweed's got this great characteristic of kind of being, I don't know exactly what you call it. I think recyclable, or can be grown without a negative economic impact. What makes you so sure of that?
Ecologic impact.
Yeah.
Well, basically, I've been working with some scientists in Sweden, with Fredrik Rönndahl from KTH Stockholm, and he's been growing seaweed in a sea farm for 5 years. So he has done all this analysis, and he basically explains that seaweed can be one of the matters through which Sweden could try and push towards the SDG goals of carbon neutrality and so forth. And he has explained to me a lot of the concepts of what happens when you grow seaweed. So you basically have 2 growth phases for that large macroalgae that I'm working with. One is in a greenhouse on land until you have a little plantling, and then that kind of is seated onto a little rope or a string that is then twirled around the rope and hung into the ocean. And then depending where you hang it, it can have a benefit. So if you hang it over a sandy sea bottom, for example, it creates a habitat for fish where normally there is not much growing. So then you can already imagine, what if we are putting the seaweed exactly where we need better habitats? What if we kind of put seaweed farms where we have kind of desert in the ocean? And at the same time, it can grow without any excess fertilizer if you do it in the right way, because it pulls out the fertilizer that causes all these algae blooms and all these things that comes into the ocean through our rivers from our farms. So in a way, already there you have 2 things, but there's also a lot of research done around it being a filter around fish farms, for example, filtering out some of the fish species. And I think it's now kind of sometimes, especially in Europe, the question, how can we make it viable? How can we make it economically viable to have a seaweed farm in the place where it can be of best benefit to its ecosystem and to its social system? Because I think every ecological imbalance directly leads to a social imbalance in the human system that is attached to this. So basically, it's not 2 systems. If you have overfishing, you have unemployed fishermen, and you have a decline in this community. So in a way, maybe if we stop seeing ourselves as being so separate from our ecosystem, we see that we have to rebalance the social and ecological system together.
Okay, but wouldn't that mean that if you engage with that kind of that really wide lifespan of seaweed, like where do you place it, who do you work with, what do you make from it, does this sort of design practice become quite a local practice? Because it doesn't seem like there's sort of universal applications that you can find. We are so used to that idea that you find a solution and then you just roll it out universally, but it sounds like that's quite a local, very specific practice where you need to find very specific answers for very specific context.
Yes and no. I think, yes, you always have to apply it locally. And that's what makes it so beautiful if it's a network of people, because there will be people who are local in Mexico or local in, Sweden, and they will have different issues in their ecosystem, and they will have different potentials for seaweed and so forth. But what can be shared is some of the techniques of how to make it into a craft, how to make it into materials, how to make bioplastic from it, how to make a leather-like material from it, and so forth. So if we share that, then we can have these locally produced goods that, in a way, I hope will tie in with the local crafts, so that can support the local craft, and that can not be something alien coming from outside, but actually be done by the local craftsmen.
Okay.
Yeah.
And talking about craft, that's a good segue into what you were just mentioning, leather and all those things. So just on a very practical level, what have you found? What kind of applications does seaweed offer itself to? What could be made from it?
So my biggest dream would be to find a way of taking the entire seaweed sheet and make it into a leather-like surface. And this is in a way how far I got so far. This is the material that I've made all these structures that you can see online with. I found a way of keeping it soft without it kind of becoming an alien, like a synthetic material. So if it goes back into the ocean, it can kind of degrade just like an original, like an organic material. It's still an organic material, basically.
But hang on,
But
just one sec. Quick question.
not,
This
Mhm.
this
Yeah.
comes from a very special place, right? It doesn't grow everywhere. From what I understand, it's
Yeah,
a very
this particular seaweed is from Japan.
mm-hmm.
But that was simply because, well, they have gorgeous seaweed in Japan, but also because it was a logistics question, because I needed to get lots of seaweed for my tests, and they were selling it as food, basically. So it was, in a way, in a form that I could buy it. I also kind of paid a diver to dive for some seaweed, and then I had a suitcase full of wet seaweed and went back to my home, and it was just logistically more difficult. But then I'm also working with Swedish seaweed, and there is some great seaweed in France, in Scotland, and Iceland, basically.
But you said you needed it in large quantities. Is that because Japan has quite a culture with seaweed and they do use it quite regularly as food, and so I'm assuming they have a much kind of larger and more developed industry around it, so it's easy to just procure a large amount.
Yeah.
Whereas
Yeah, and you know what you're getting, basically, and it's being harvested when it needs to be harvested, and then it's being dried, and I can just buy it like this. But also seaweed has a history of thousands of years that we can learn from. I have the feeling, because you were asking about localities and how to grow it locally, I have the feeling that Asian cultures quite often have been a lot better of learning from Western cultures than we are learning from them. Quite often when I speak with seaweed growers, they're like, yes, we're just coming up with these ideas. And I'm just like, wow, they've been growing seaweed for such a long time in Asia. But I think it's also the question of adapting. It's a different type of seaweed. It's a different type of ocean. It's a different type of current. It's a different type of market. So in a way, you can't just take the knowledge. You always have to adapt it.
well, and I suppose you can't really take the actual, I mean, there's thousands of seaweed varieties, right? And you're probably not encouraging this idea of taking the Japanese variety and importing it to Sweden, because you don't really know
no,
what.
that's a disaster. No, yeah.
Exactly.
And there's very strict regulation against that, luckily, because
Okay.
There's basically an Alien Species Act. You're not allowed to bring anything. It's growing in the open ocean, so you're not allowed to bring any kind of foreign species in, because it might disastrously multiply and kind of kill everything that's native, basically.
Okay.
So
There's an international set of regulations around that, is there? Or
yeah, there is, but I don't know whether it's international or on national level, but every country has this regulation as far as I know. But the problem is that it's not really solving the whole issue completely, because of course a lot of ships, when they do one journey with an empty hull, they take in water, and that water, for example, has seeds in there. It might have, like snail eggs in there and so forth. So you have already, through shipping, have quite a big contamination with species, but not necessarily with seaweed. I think it's more
right.
snails and other alien species. Yeah.
Okay, so going back to the seaweed you've got there, which I think is kelp, right? That's the kind of word for it, as I understand. And you said you found a way of keeping it soft and pliable. What do you do with it?
That's the magic question. Well, I can't share it completely, because we share it within the Department of Seaweed. But the thing is, it's quite easy, and it's not solving the big issue yet.
Because it's
building a bridge between molecule chains so that they are long chains and not short ones, and that they are staying soft and supple. But it's very highly reactive, so it's not really working yet for your everyday leather jacket, or your amazing shoes, or for your handbag, which would be great to get into this bigger mainstream scenario.
Okay, so going back to that question, what is an application you're dreaming of? It is leather. You'd love to make a substitute for leather from it,
Mm-hmm.
and you think it's possible?
I think it's possible, yes. But I think it would be, yes, I think it's possible, but it needs a lot of R&D. So it needs a really kind of investment in lab work and in doing that. And it's quite, well, I don't know, maybe, yeah. So I think it is possible, but it needs a lot of development with a lot of these materials. Also, when you speak with the people who are looking at fungi leathers and so forth, it's quite easy to make the first prototypes, to make the first, oh, wow, this could all be possible pieces. But then to reach a market with all the regulation and all these kind of, you know, material testing and so forth, it requires quite different skills and quite different working methods. And in a way, a much longer term structure. And maybe this is something that we haven't achieved yet with the Department of Seaweed, that we'd love to actually be more embedded with a lab, with kind of an institution that actually says, okay, great, let's do this together.
Right, but our time's nearly up, but this was going to be my last question too. I imagine, you know, doing something that is so new, often, you know, we're so used to something being compartmentalized and being situated within something. So funding structures, you know, fund something in a particular discipline, or they fund a particular thing. So how can something like the Department of Seaweed become something that more people endeavor, where sort of designers and scientists and artists and all kinds of people come together to not only imagine something, but also to kind of be able to see it through and test it? What's needed for that?
Well, I think what's needed from my very own perspective is kind of a structure that is a bit longer term, that's a bit more not like, oh yeah, here 3 next month you can do something, but that allows us to actually employ people to really look at this and to really build this research environment that might, you know, last for a couple of years. I think that's the one biggest thing, because at the moment everything still runs together to very few hands, and then we have to kind of, you know, think who does what, and then it ends up all on the same table. I think it really needs that deeper engagement. So that would be great to have like a longer term structure of funding. But at the same time, it would be great to, I mean, it's important to have that with the right partners who share the right values, because we don't want to just have the next big seller of like, wow, now seaweed is the next big thing, but actually to really try and use seaweed as a blueprint for doing things differently, for finding another way of engaging with materials and with our ecosystem.
Okay, so it sounds like the ideal environment would perhaps be still in a university environment, or somewhere where there is no sort of commercial driver behind something who has an agenda, or?
I think it also needs a commercial pull, maybe, because otherwise it
Right.
will just land in research. I think it needs both. It needs the research, but it also needs somebody who then goes, okay, great, let's do something with it, but all with the right mindset. So,
Right.
yeah.
Okay, so ideally a whole lot of, just like you are bringing together designers, scientists, all kinds of people, a whole lot of funding entities would need to get together too and somehow combine their interests. Would that be?
Not necessarily. I mean, there are great funding structures, for example, some of the EU funds, some of the Horizon 2020 and so forth, that do especially look at transdisciplinary projects. And in a way, this Department of Seaweed could be such a project with like longer term kind of,
Right.
you know, funding structures.
Okay.
So for example, that could be a way.
Okay, so that's the way forward then for you, is it?
I don't know if I can get down and write these applications. That's kind of the other question.
Okay, well, it sounds very exciting, and I hope it does come together. I mean, it has come together, but I hope it gets the traction that it needs, because it does sound very exciting. So, yes, our time's kind of up, I think. So, I really enjoyed talking to you, and
Great, and
hopefully get together here soon again.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Julia. Bye.
Bye-bye.